Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will go ahead and get started in just a minute. We'll let everyone join in before we get started. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for a systems change approach to ending sexual violence with Caitlin LeMay. My name is Brenna Chase. I'm the Director of Communications and Training at MOVA. And before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to go over some really brief logistics. First and foremost, this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you should be able to see the presenters, the ASL interpreters, as well as the presentation. If you have any questions today during the session, please use the Q&A function to ask them, and we will get to them by the end of today's session. We have ASL interpretation and cart captioning available today. To view those closed captions, you can go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the little up arrow next to the closed caption icon, and select Show Subtitle. If at any point you are having trouble viewing the ASL interpreters or closed captions, or have any other tech issues today, please feel free to use that chat function and message all panelists, and myself or my colleague Charlotte will be happy to assist you. With that, I will move forward with introducing our presenter today. We are thrilled to be joined by Caitlin LeMay. Caitlin has over a decade of professional experience in sexual violence prevention, community organizing, and systems change. She is a bold visionary who is willing to think outside of the box. She has dedicated her career to identifying new ways to engage communities, programs, and organizations to shift the focus towards preventing sexual violence from the root causes. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Caitlin. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Brenna. Thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to having this discussion that I am very passionate about and find very interesting myself. So as Brenna mentioned, we are going to be talking today about a systems change approach to ending sexual violence. I'll give you a heads up, I'm using multiple monitors, so if I'm looking off screen, that is why. So the objectives for today's workshop is, my hope is that you all will walk away with an understanding of the role that systems change can play in violence prevention, that you will have the skills to be able to dive deep into prevention programming to understand what makes programs more effective than others. And lastly, I hope that you will gain the skills in identifying some of the root causes of issues such as sexual violence. So I always like to start off and share a little bit about me. I know Brenna shared my bio with you all, but just a little bit more about me. As you can see on the slide, the biggest picture is of my son, Odin, who is just over a year old. He's 14 months old now. And so as a mother is one of my key identities that I like to share with folks. I also serve a couple different roles, and so I'm here today as the founder and principal consultant of Leading Upstream, which is my consulting business that focuses primarily on violence prevention programming. But I'm also the director of the End FGMC US network. So the US network is the only national network in the US that's dedicated towards ending female genital mutilation and cutting. And so I'm the director of that. And I also volunteer as the director of operations with an organization called Uplift, which works to end sexual violence in online communities and fandoms, video gaming communities, things like that. So I serve all these multiple different roles, and I will bring my experience in all of these different roles here today with you all. I will also say, as a disclaimer, that I have had to put down two of my cats in the past 6 weeks, unexpectedly, the second of which happened this morning. So if I'm a little bit off my game, that would be why that I'm kind of mourning my pets today. So that's a little bit about me. And what I would like for you all to do is just in the chat, introduce yourselves. Say who you are, your title, organization. If you want to share what you hope to get out of this workshop, that would be great. Really anything that you want to share. We'll be doing a lot of activities today in the chat, so it would be great for you all to kind of get to know each other a little bit. We have a video to watch. I hope to break up this workshop in different ways instead of me just talking at you for an hour and a half. So hopefully it will be engaging. Please use the chat. That's how we will be able to be really successful in this workshop. And there will be a break built in halfway through as well. So thank you all for introducing yourself in the chat. I'm going to move on, but please keep introducing yourselves. And the first question that I want to pose to you all is, when you think of sexual violence prevention, what kind of programs or strategies come to mind? So again, please use the chat and throw out some of these strategies that come to mind when you think about how you would prevent sexual violence. And I give an example. I hear a lot about self-defense classes, especially for young girls and women. So if you can write in the chat just what comes to mind when you think of sexual violence prevention programs or activities or strategies. I'll give you all a few moments to think about it. Education on healthy relationships. Policy development to support healthy relationships, absolutely. Programming education in schools, starting young, absolutely. Education in schools again. Healthy relationships, education, yep, conversations, absolutely. Educating all genders on their bodies, starting from when they're young, yep. Teaching consent, absolutely. As a mom, my kid is just over a year old, but we've been having conversations about consent from day one, pretty much. Community awareness raising, yeah, lots of different education components, both in the schools, but communities, workplace culture, making people aware of power differentials and how a power over approach exacerbates that differential. Yep. Any specific type of programs or strategies, like I mentioned, self-defense. I also often think about, if you all remember, there was a moment where color changing nail polish was a thing, where somebody could put this nail polish on and dip it into their drink to see if it had been drugged. That's still a thing, Femina says. Yeah, I believe it. Take back the night is another example. Absolutely. Anything else? Bars that have code words for people that are being bothered or harassed. Yeah, there's the angel drink, if you all have heard of that, where someone can order the angel drink, and that's sort of a code word. Safe dates, yeah. Changing social norms, yeah, we'll be talking about that today for sure. Safe apps, yeah, there's so many apps and more are being built every day. Great, thank you all. Any program that makes the potential victim responsible for preventing the violence is only ever a Band-Aid approach. Thank you, Louise, for mentioning that. We will definitely be talking about that. So yes, you are absolutely right. And that's part of why we're having this conversation as well, and coming up with these different ideas. So as we continue through this conversation, keep some of these strategies and activities and programs that we brainstormed in mind, because we're going to sort of dive a little bit deeper into some of them. So we're going to start off by talking about just Prevention 101. I've been looking through your introductions. I see some of you work in prevention, so this will probably be, just, you already know this information, hopefully. But for those who may not be as involved in prevention work, hopefully this will be helpful. So there's 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention is stopping the violence before it even happens. So no sort of violence or impact has been made yet. We're stopping it before it happens. Secondary prevention is identifying the trauma at the earliest possible stage, and then intervening at that point, intervening as early as possible after violence has occurred. And then tertiary prevention is providing support to prevent long-term effects. And so once again, the violence has happened, and secondary prevention may also be going on at the same time. But we're also trying to prevent long-term effects such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, all of these things that come up as a result of experiencing violence. And so many of you may have heard this analogy before. I always like to tell it because truthfully, this analogy is what inspired the name of my consulting business, Leading Upstream. But think about a stream or a river. And at the bottom of this river or stream is a town or a village. And the folks at this village keep going up to the stream and finding people that are floating down the stream, and they need help. And so these people keep pulling out the folks in the stream and saving them, pulling them out of the water. And that just keeps happening over and over and over again. And they can't figure out why. And so they just keep pulling them out. And then one person says, maybe we need to go upstream. Let's go upstream and figure out why people are falling into this stream and ending up on our shore. So they do exactly that. And maybe they found that there was a bridge that was broken and people were falling into it. Maybe they found that there should have been rails along the side, and or maybe they found that there were no signs saying danger, right? There's a stream up here. Be cautious, be careful. Could have been a wide range of things. Maybe there was somebody pushing these folks into the stream, right? But they don't know unless they go upstream and figure that out. And so I like this analogy because it really outlines the different levels of prevention. So primary prevention is doing exactly that and going upstream and saying, what is causing this? What is causing these people to fall into this stream? And let's stop it. Let's repair that bridge. Let's put up some guardrails. Let's put up some signs. Let's remove this person that's pushing them in, right? Whatever is causing it, let's stop that. Secondary prevention is pulling people out, right? They're washing up at the shore of this town downstream. And so secondary prevention is pulling them out of it. Let's save them, right? We gotta get them to safety. And then tertiary prevention is let's wrap them up in warm blankets. Let's give them some food to eat. Let's dry them off, give them some dry clothes, right? And prevent any sort of long-term effects of this. Let's get them medical care, make sure that there aren't any injuries, right? And so this example really sort of outlines the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. All levels are important and all levels of prevention need to happen. I personally like to focus on primary prevention, right? Because my goal is to put myself out of business. I don't want anyone else to ever experience violence, right? And so I want to stop it from starting. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. So I always love this quote because it outlines what I shared perfectly. It's by Desmond Tutu, where he said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. I love to incorporate quotes throughout my presentation, so you may see a couple of those. So now that we talked about, the 3 levels of prevention, we're going to switch into different theories of change. And this is when we start getting into what systems change is. So some of these theories you may have seen before. So this model, the 6 conditions of systems change, is by FSG in a document of theirs called The Water of Systems Change. I highly recommend reading it. I think it's really important and has a lot of great information in there. But what they outline is these 3 main pieces: structural change, relational change, and transformative change. And so within that are policies, practices, resource flows, relationships and connections, power dynamics, and mental models. You all mentioned all the programs that you all brainstormed in the chat fall under these, right? We heard a lot about relationships and connections. Education can fall under that. Power dynamics. I saw someone mention policies and laws came up. Mental models around cultural and social norms. And then moving on, again, many of you have probably seen this, but this is a spectrum of prevention. And so there's 6 levels to prevention, according to this model, which is influencing policy and legislation, changing organizational practices, fostering coalitions and networks, educating providers, promoting community education, and strengthening individual knowledge and skills. So a lot of similarities, right? And again, the ideas and the strategies that you brainstormed in the chat all fall under this as well, right? And so I bring these 2 models up because the first one we looked at is around systems change, and this one is about prevention. And you can see that they actually really overlap with each other. And so when you look at them side by side, you can see how similar they are. They both talk about policies. They both talk about practices. They both talk about resource flows, which can happen through coalitions and networks, relationships and connections with providers, with community education, right? Individual knowledge and skills, which also ties into mental models, right? So these, when you look at them side by side, they really overlap with each other, which to me makes it clear that in order to prevent violence, we have to come at it from a social change approach because of how well these 2 models fit together. And so as a result, when you overlap these 2 models, they really fall under these 3 different levers. So there's policy change, right? And so that can be through laws, through organizational practices, as we saw on the spectrum of prevention. Cultural change, some of these mental models, some of this education pieces that we talked about and we saw in the models, and then practice change, individual behavior. It could also be through relationships. And so these 3, at the intersection of these 3 levers is where we see real prevention happening, right? When all of these levers are being pulled and being tapped into. I saw a question, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes, you will get a copy of this. And so for prevention to happen, we need to address all 3 of these levers. Is there impact if we just change policies? Absolutely, right? I'm not saying that's useless, right? But we can change all of the policies and the laws that we want. But if there's not also cultural change to go with that, or if there's not education about what those laws are, I see that in my work at the US and FGMC network. is we have laws on the books banning female genital mutilation in the US. But a lot of folks don't know about these laws. And so it actually hasn't, very few people have actually been prosecuted under these laws because nobody really knows that they exist, right? And so how can we, policy alone doesn't change things. We also need the education component. We also need to change behavior. We need to change practices as well. So, so when all of these three things, all of these three levers are happening, that's where we see systems change. So I hope this model makes sense to you. I kind of created it based off of my understanding of this. And so I hope that it's a helpful visual to see how all of these topics intersect with each other. Let me see. Let's see. What time is it? 1:20. Let's not going to take a break quite yet, but we will in a little bit. So I was originally going to do small group discussion, but we aren't able to do breakout sessions. So we're going to do this through the chat. And so what we were initially going to do is in small groups, talk about, have you pick one sort of strategy that we had brainstormed together and talk about them specifically. But what we can do instead is talk through them in the chat. So does anybody have one of the strategies that you want to dive deeper in? Feel free to write it in the chat. Anyone can pick one. Or if you are running a prevention program yourself and you want to explore that one more deeply, feel free to put that in the chat and we can talk about it. Okay. Femina said, okay, what's your example, Femina? Femina mentioned that, mentioned tertiary prevention, that she has an example of that one. And other folks, feel free to add in more. We will probably have time to go through a couple because I really want us to dive deeper into specific examples because I think that can be helpful at really kind of grasping this content. All right, so Femina mentioned going to the hospital when someone meets a SANE, a sexual assault nurse examiner. Great example. So Femina already mentioned that's tertiary prevention, absolutely. And there may be aspects of secondary prevention. It's possible you can have multiple, you can do a couple different levels of prevention at the same time, but it absolutely is primarily tertiary prevention, right? When someone goes to the hospital and they're meeting with a SANE, they're obviously having evidence collection. Well, not always, but that's one of the purposes of it. But they're also getting checked out for any medical injuries. They're getting checked out for, getting supports provided, maybe hopefully information to their local rape crisis center to help maybe reduce the chances of PTSD or depression, and just sort of that access to supportive services. So absolutely tertiary. So a SANE, meeting with a SANE at the hospital, does this address policy change, cultural change, practice change, or a combination? What do you all think? Combination, but I think of policy change for sure. Yep. What do other folks think? And Femina, you mentioned combination. So what else in addition to policy change do you think that this addresses? Combination of practice and policy. Yep. Any other thoughts? Culture and policy. Okay. So folks who are saying policy, please share more about that. What about it is policy? Folks who are saying cultural, can you please say more? And folks who are saying practice, like what makes these either policy, cultural, or practice change? Heather says combination, but also a chance for practice change in hospitals and RCCs. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It's a practice, right? For the hospital to call the local RCC, right? That's a practice that can happen. It can also be a policy. It could be written into the hospital or the SANE's policy that they must call the RCC, which I think is the case most of the time. But again, you can have a policy and people don't actually practice it, right? Or vice versa. You can have a practice of calling the local RCC, but it's never actually written down as a policy. Let me just go back a little bit. Not making a survivor wait in the waiting room, a room with a bathroom for the survivor to stay in. Yep, those are great examples of both practice and policy changes. Importance of education for practitioners. Yeah, all the policies in the world cannot restore power and control to the victim. Absolutely, agree completely. And if the practitioner does not ask what works for the survivor, yeah, absolutely. And so that's a practice, right? Of asking what works for the survivor. And that practice requires training. We need to train these practitioners on what to say, what to ask, how to provide this level of support. Does anyone else have another example, another prevention strategy that you want to talk about? Chris says, working with agencies to look at policies on 6 levels. 1 level is doing environmental mapping, have difficulty getting an agency to prioritize prevention. Yeah, prevention often is not prioritized, right? Not just at agencies, but look at funding, right? Funding for prevention doesn't even compare to funding for supportive services. And this isn't to say that supportive services isn't important. Of course it is. I'm a licensed social worker. I've provided lots of therapy to survivors of trauma. I get the importance of supportive services. And we need funding for prevention as well, right? They're both really, really important, and prevention definitely doesn't get the attention. All right, I see Louise says power over approach. I'm working with a school that did not report child sexual abuse. Reviewing their policies, they were all in compliance with educational code and law, but the school was unable to put them into practice. This is a great example. The culture was not supportive and the approach was so punitive that it discourages reporting, both by the victims and mandated reporters. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Louise, because this is a perfect example of how these 3 issues intersect and how we really need to address all 3 levers: the policy, the cultural, and the practice. So there was a policy in place, and this is my understanding based on your comments. So if I get anything wrong, Louise, please feel free to correct me in the chat. But there was a policy in place. They were in compliance by having this policy. But the culture was to not report, right? Or that it was punitive. And so even though there was a policy that says you must report, if you're afraid as a worker that you're going to get in trouble for following that policy, right, you're probably not going to follow it. And so that cultural piece has to be there. There has to be that cultural support of the policies. And so that obviously impacts the practice, right? If you don't feel safe following the policy, if you don't feel supported in following the policy because of the culture, then the practice of following that policy is not going to happen. And I hope that makes sense. But I think this is a really great example of how these levers really intersect. So thank you for sharing that, Louise. Any other comments or any questions? If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A part of the webinar. I believe Brenna is keeping an eye on that, and she'll interject if any questions come up. So please feel free to ask questions as we go. And if anybody has another prevention strategy that you want to kind of dive deeper into, please feel free to write it in the chat. I'll give you all a minute to think about it and provide any suggestions. All right, so I don't see any other suggestions, so we can move on. But we will definitely continue talking about this as we go. I think it's helpful to look at specific examples and see how this information applies to them. So we'll keep coming back to this as we continue. So let's take a all right, let me just do this one slide and then we'll take a quick break. So this again is my sort of own definition of systems change based off of some other definitions. I found there isn't really a standard definition of systems change. There's a lot of different thoughts out there, different ideas, but not really a standard one. And so for me and my approach and my understanding of systems change, this is what I came up with, which systems change is radically shifting the policies, cultures, and practices to address the root causes of complex societal issues. So today, we're specifically talking about sexual violence as one of those complex societal issues, but systems change obviously applies to all sorts of them. So I mentioned I also do work around female genital mutilation. So systems change, is helpful at addressing that, but it's also necessary to address things like racism and white supremacy, right? Which we'll talk about more a little bit later. It's also helpful in talking about sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, right? All of these different systems of oppression are complex societal issues that systems change is necessary at solving and changing. So with that being said, let's take a 10-minute break. I know we all live in the world of being on Zoom calls all day, every day. And so I think taking a break partway through is very important. So let's take let's see, it's 1:33. Let's come back at 1:40. And so I will turn my camera off and we'll take a quick break and we'll return at 1:40. So grab some coffee, tea, water, whatever you need. Thank you all. All right, let's come back together. It is 1:40. So this came up earlier, and so thank you. I forgot who mentioned it, but talking about why we can't prevent rape against ourselves, right? And so, as you all know, I know many of you are advocates in the domestic and sexual violence field, so you all probably know the statistic, but 85 to 90% of all sexual assaults occur by somebody that we know. They are close to us in one way or another. They are our partners, family members, neighbors, childcare providers, but somebody that we know 85 to 90% of the time. It's even higher for children, right? And because we know the folks that children have access to are people close to them. And so the reason why we can't prevent rape against ourselves is because a lot of these strategies that are designed to prevent rape, but that put the onus on the quote unquote potential victim, they don't consider things like grooming and coercion, which happen over time, right? They're based off of this myth of the stranger in the bushes. So I'm not here to diss any sort of program or prevention strategy, because I think they all have some benefits to them. But things like the color changing nail polish, for example, that you would use at a bar, right? If you're going out to test your drink. If you are hanging out with your partner at home, are you going to be testing the drink that they give you? Probably not, right? Are you going to test a drink that your parent gives you? Probably not, right? And so this idea of color changing nail polish is, again, basing it off of the stranger at the bar that you don't know, you have no relation to, right? And that they're going to drug your drink and sexually assault you. Does that happen? Absolutely. Yes. Not saying that never happens. But for a majority of sexual assaults, that's not the case. And so something like color changing nail polish is not going to prevent a majority of sexual assaults, right? And similarly, programs like self-defense classes, again, not to diss them, there's a lot of research about the benefits of self-defense classes, and things like increasing self-esteem and confidence and things like that. But you can learn all the self-defense strategies. But if you are being groomed by your uncle, right, or your neighbor who has spent a lot of time grooming you and building that trust with you, and coercing you, you're not going to use these self-defense moves on them, most likely. And so, again, these prevention strategies that are based off of the stranger in the bushes scenario of how you need to respond right then in the middle, right then and there during an attack, or to prevent this stranger from sexually assaulting you, they may help prevent some sexual assault. So again, there's benefits to that, because any sexual assault that we can prevent is worth it in my mind. But they're not going to prevent a majority of them. And so we need to keep this in mind when we're developing prevention programs, is instead of putting the responsibility and the onus on a potential victim, quote unquote, to not get raped or sexually assaulted, but instead put the responsibility on all of us, right? And when we look at a systems change model, that is included in it, right? That is when we need to talk about the cultural change. We need to change the culture of rape culture, right? We need folks to intervene when a rape joke is being told. We need folks to step in when you see somebody being inappropriate. We all have that responsibility. And we know that that is more effective if we can change the culture, the social norms, the mental models, right? Change the practices. If somebody is telling a rape joke and every time they tell it, somebody is saying, that's not okay, right? That's going to change their practice of telling this joke. That will get them to start questioning and thinking differently about their behavior. They are going to get the very clear message that jokes like that are unacceptable, right? And so a systems change approach to ending sexual violence really focuses on all of us and all of our role in ending sexual violence, not just people who may be sexually assaulted in the future. I'm just taking a quick second to look through the comments. We've been talking about systems change at our agency. Is it Amanda is saying, we've been talking about systems change at our agency in relation to racial justice. We've had policies in place for things like anti-discrimination based on race and gender, but are realizing that some of them can be reevaluated. Absolutely, yeah. And when I say policies, I mean that in all definitions of policies. That means policies at our organizations, our employee manual, right? Policies statewide, locally, local ordinances, laws, again, locally, statewide, federally, all of the entire definition of policy, right? From small policies, even within our families, right? To, federal laws. I think about another example of a policy that may not be a traditional example, but in my family, we have the quote unquote policy that if my child does not want to hug or kiss you, then they don't have to, right? Talking about consent. So that's our policy. And we communicate that policy with our other family members and friends, anyone who is going to be spending time with my son Odin. So that's a policy, right? It may not be written down, it may not be formal, right? But it's a policy. And so thank you for sharing. I wanted to specify what I mean by policy. And as Amanda mentioned, policies have to be reevaluated. And if we have a policy on the book that is not being practiced, or again, the culture isn't there to support that policy, then it needs to be reevaluated. How do we make sure that this policy is, one, doing its job and is effective, and two, is being followed? So thank you for sharing that. Louise says most of us who experience child sexual assault are quickly stressed into dissociation and freeze, therefore self-defense is of limited effectiveness. Absolutely, yeah. And talk about the neurobiology of trauma, the fight, flight, or freeze response, and most folks freeze, right? And so there's not a lot that, our brain that rules, right, on how we respond. And if our brain is telling us to freeze, we can have all the training that we want, but it may not kick in. So thank you for sharing that. Any questions about this? Okay. And we're going to come back to this too, because the next piece is we're going to talk about some of the root causes of sexual assault, of which includes systems of oppression, such as racism and white supremacy. And so we're going to actually come back to this piece about putting the responsibility on the quote unquote potential victim. So I've mentioned this multiple times so far, but we need to focus on the root causes, right? We need to go upstream. What is causing these folks to fall into the stream? What is causing sexual assault to happen in the first place? Without going to that root cause, we don't fully understand the depth of the problem or the complexity of the problem. And as you saw by my definition of systems change is designed to address those complexities and those root causes. So for sexual violence, I have this video that I want to share because I think it does a really great job at explaining the root causes of domestic, sexual, and intimate violence. So I'm going to, it was made by Futures Without Violence. I'm sure you will recognize some of the folks in this video because they've been doing great work in the field. So this video is just under 7 minutes long. So the sound should be working, but if it's not, please let me know in the chat. But let me we'll watch this.
What guides my anti-violence work, as anti-oppression work, is a deep understanding that oppression is one of the root causes of violence, and the understanding that we can't end one form of violence without ending all forms of violence. And so as advocates, especially for me as an African-American advocate, it was not separable to me. I could not separate one thing from the other. I've always seen anti-oppression work, anti-racism work as primary anti-violence work.
Anti-racism is a vital component of anti-violence work. These videos were created by and for advocates to encourage dialogue and collective action in centering anti-racism work in the movement to end intimate violence.
I think for me, as a queer woman of color who's the daughter of immigrants from India, who's non-binary in terms of my gender identity, I think about anti-violence work as anti-oppression work because that's what my life is. I was raped as a child and in a house in which my dad was also beating my mom. So a commitment to anti-violence work is part of my own healing trajectory. But if I didn't also fight homophobia and racism and xenophobia, I still wouldn't be fighting for my own liberation.
It is critical for advocates to be doing anti-racism work because it's important for us to do prevention. I mean, prevention to me is the core of what we do.
The anti-violence field has created a service delivery model that works for disproportionately white, heterosexual, able-bodied, temporarily poor women. And when we think of anyone outside of those categories, they are not being served adequately. They're not having access to resources.
I see racism as part of this constellation of oppression, each interacting with the other, influencing the other, compounding the other. I see racism as part of an intersectional relationship with power. And so for me, that is the core of racism, this intersectional relationship with power based on white supremacy. And you'll see it in all forms of oppression.
Racism looks different in terms of different countries in the world. In the United States, racism is specifically when somebody's prejudice is backed up by the way the state is set up, by the laws and the institutions and the policies of that government actually sanctioning or supporting someone's personal prejudice. And so in the United States, this is a country that was founded on the genocide and enslavement of indigenous people here, and then later the kidnapping and enslavement of people from Africa. And when you look back at the founding laws and policies of the United States, we see that people who were indigenous or who were enslaved Africans were not considered human beings. They were considered property. Native people in the United States were not even given the right to vote until the 1920s. And so there's a long legacy of the prejudice of the white people who founded the United States. We need to acknowledge that when people were enslaved, they were also raped systematically. And this has been well documented. If you look at the Whitney Plantation Museum down in Louisiana, we now have memorials and testimonies of slaves, particularly slave girls, talking about how the slave master would come in and take them to be raped at night. Sexual violence was actually part of slavery. It was part of colonization. And so if we want to end intimate violence, if we want to end child sexual abuse, if we want to end sexual violence in the United States, we have to grapple with the history of racism and colonization and slavery in this country. It's actually part of the work together. One thing that we know for sure is the DSM now names racism as a cause of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we know that people of color in the United States are experiencing PTSD at higher rates. We also know that when a parent, for example, is living with PTSD, their judgment may be impaired if they get triggered. They may not be able to act with love in a moment of being triggered and may be more likely to yell at their child, for example. So there's part of the cycle of violence there. For people of color, particularly poor people of color who are being heavily policed, who are being over-incarcerated, we know that oftentimes in interactions with police, people's lives are on the line, people are being raped by the police, particularly for transgender and queer people of color, for Black people, for Indigenous people. When you're absorbing that level of violence, violence is a learned behavior. And that lesson comes back into your homes, back into your communities. And so, I think it's a very difficult burden that we have as people of color who have survived violence to name the rates at which we experience it from the people that we love. And if we really want to end intimate violence, ultimately we have to end white supremacy. And that burden is also on our white allies to help us undo this very violent system that we're all living within and in which people of color are suffering the most.
It's not our fault that we ended up in the situation where racism and white supremacy are as prevalent as they are. It is not our fault. And it is totally possible for us to take this on in our lives. I know that as advocates, we all want to leave the world in a better place than when we came into the world. And by being deliberate about ending racism, by approaching the work with joy and delight in ourselves and in the humanity that we see in others, it's a win-win situation. There's no way we can lose.
All right. So what questions, aha moments, just general thoughts that came up for you when you watched that quick video? Please share in the chat. I know for me, I heard Amita talk about, the policies that were in place and used to oppress Indigenous and Black folks in this country. And so that links directly with what we're talking about as policy as one of these levers. If our policies are working against us and are actually in place to harm people, then how much good can changing practice and culture be, right? Like we need, policies working in our favor. And we're seeing that still today, right? Looking at, this conversation about Roe v. Wade, looking at all these discussions about police brutality and funding for police, and criminalization pieces. Yeah, I agree. We need the policies to work for us. Absolutely. And historically, our policies have not been working for predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Any other thoughts, questions? All right. Carolyn says, interesting about the slave masters going to pick young girls at night for molestation. They were not able to defend themselves, hence the stigma within communities of color. Sorry, my screen's moving on me. Where we don't speak on molestation in our families by our family members, learned behaviors. Absolutely, yeah. As was discussed in the video, a lot of this is learned behaviors that get passed on generation to generation. They make a great case for policy, cultural, and practices change. Yeah, absolutely, which is why I like to play that video, right? It aligns perfectly with what we're talking about today. Bringing up that racism is in the DSM, reminds Femina of we tried to get our city council in my city to think about that racism is a public health crisis. Yeah, absolutely. And that's about policy change. And another key piece to policy change is that policy change often comes with funding too, right? And we need funding. I know everyone on this call can relate to the challenges of having enough money to do what we need to do. And something as big as systems change, right? Particularly ending these very complex societal issues like sexual assault. We need a lot of funding to do that work. If we need to address all three levers, we need the funding to do that. And a lot of funding, a lot of grants will fund one of those levers, right? And so I could do a whole nother workshop about funding and how that plays a part in the prevention programming activities that we do. I can speak for myself. I know I've run a number of prevention programs throughout the last, decade plus, and some of them have not been ideal and not what I would typically like to do, but it was either dictated by funders or we were limited because we didn't have much funding. So funding is a key piece to this. And so I feel like that's important to note because I'm talking about doing all of this work, addressing all of these different levers, also understanding that if we don't have the funding to do that, then it's very difficult. So I can relate and sympathize with that stress of not having the money to do what we ultimately would like to do. As a Puerto Rican, we are seen as second-class citizens, and therefore many policies don't apply to us. Absolutely. Political corruption can also be a barrier to achieve systems change, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Many programs are affected by the corruption and therefore don't reach victims and can't create the change. It all goes hand in hand. Absolutely. Yeah, spot on. Thank you for sharing that. It is so worrisome that the current political atmosphere is moving in a direction to make prevention even more difficult than ever before. I agree completely. What can we do when most of the funding goes to one organization that promotes a carceral approach to sexual violence prevention and denies the existence of rape culture? That is a big question. And I don't necessarily have a very specific answer to that, but I think, when we talk about, when we are truly doing a systems change model and we are working on the policies and we're working on the cultural change and we're working on the practice change, that also impacts funders, right? Funders are people, right? Just like us. And so that I think is another example why this approach is so important, because if we can educate funders, if we can pass policies that increase funding, then that is going to impact funders and what they decide is important to fund or not. And so yes, thank you for that. I can again, in my other role as the director of the NFGMC network, we were really excited because FGM was just included in the Violence Against Women Act for the first time in the history of VAWA. And so that was a big deal for us because that meant funding, right? Because there's funding out of VAWA. And we often, the FGM doesn't get funded in the US like domestic or sexual violence does. And so for us, that was such a huge win for it to even be mentioned, because that communicates that this is a worthy cause to be funded. And that took a lot of activism, a lot of education to even include it into VAWA. And so I bring that up because that's just an example of how, a systems change approach can impact funding ultimately. We haven't gotten funding yet, obviously, because it's still new, but that's the hope for down the road, right? Is being able to meet with the legislators to explain why FGM is right. It's obviously violence against women, but why it needed to be included in VAWA. Any other thoughts or questions or takeaways from the video before we move on? Okay, if you do have any questions, again, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So as you can see on the screen, sexual violence is a tool of oppression. We've known this for some time. This isn't new information. And we see this regularly. We see this in areas of war. We're already seeing it in Ukraine, of rates of sexual violence going up. We see it in countries that have been colonized. Anytime that there are power differentials, we see sexual violence. And so in a truly equitable world, there will not be any sexual violence, right? Because sexual violence is a tool of oppression. And so when we talk about needing to address systems of oppression as a root cause of sexual violence, that is why. Because the ultimate goal is a truly equitable world, right? Which I know it feels very impossible, right? Trust me. But that's the ultimate goal, right? And I firmly believe that it's possible. I don't think it's going to happen this year, but I do think it's possible. And so we need a truly equitable world, and I mean that on all levels, in order for sexual violence to truly be eradicated. And so I mentioned that we were going to go back to, I can go back to the slide, around why we can't prevent rape against ourselves. And so I want to come back to this because I want to once again connect this to other systems of oppression. There was an activity that I have both participated and led a handful of times, which I won't do the full activity here with you all, but I will describe it, where basically brainstorm different things that predominantly women are told to do to not be raped. So feel free to add in some things into the chat of things that you can think of what are women told to do or not do to prevent being raped. Thinking about how they dress, for example, make sure you cover up. Don't drink, watch your drink. Yeah. Don't walk at night or have a buddy. Don't wear revealing clothes. Don't wear short skirts. Don't go out alone at night. Absolutely have a buddy. Don't flirt, but don't be rude either, right? Carry your keys in between your fingers, carry pepper spray. Again, don't drink too much or don't drink at all. Absolutely. You guys have had no problem thinking of all these things, right? We as women hear this all the time, right? And from a very young age, we have been conditioned to learn how to not be raped. And we know, as we've already talked about, these aren't effective, right? We can't prevent our own rape. Now, what are some of the messages that predominantly Black men receive as to how not to get shot by police? And again, please put your thoughts in the chat. What do we as a society tell Black men that they need to do or not do in order to not be shot by police? Don't run, comply. Absolutely. Comply again. Don't commit crimes, keep your hands visible. Yep, be respectful, don't answer back. Don't be aggressive, right? And that's in quotes, right? Because what does that even mean? And we know that Black men are seen as aggressive, even if they're not. Any other thoughts? Don't put your hand in your pocket. Yep. Don't wear a hoodie. right? We've seen that one. Yeah, keeping your hands visible, not putting them in the pocket, how they respond. You must be polite. Their looks, just their appearance, absolutely. So again, you all didn't have any trouble thinking of these things, right? These are messages that are very clear. And for Black parents, they are having these conversations with their Black sons at a very, very young age, right? These are the things that Black men, predominantly, again, not completely, obviously Black women are shot by police as well, and folks of other genders. But these are the message that predominantly Black men get as to how not to get shot by police. And again, those aren't helpful, right? We see that in the news every week, right? Of another Black man being murdered by police who followed these rules, right? And so this is, and I want to be clear that these strategies, these messages that women and Black men get is a direct result of white supremacy, right? Because these messages, we know these don't work. They're not effective, right? And it's actually in the best interest of a white supremacy culture for them not to be effective, right? White supremacy culture needs these power differentials to continue happening. And so when we are sharing these messages, we are directly contributing to white supremacy culture. And so for me, that's why it's particularly important that when we talk about preventing violence of any kind, that the responsibility is on not only all of us, but especially for those who have power, right? And so when we're looking at violence against women, men are the ones with power. And so there's extra responsibility on them. When Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the ones experiencing violence, it is the responsibility of white people, right? To stop that. And so again, it's all of our responsibility, but those in power and who have privilege have even more responsibility to help end it. So I think that we have to have these conversations about how not only these issues intersect, but how actually systems of oppression are the root cause of sexual violence, because we can't end sexual violence without also ending systems of oppression, that the prevention of these must go hand in hand. Otherwise, we're not going to prevent either one of them. So I'm wrapping up. We're almost done. There is going to be time, probably about 10 minutes to answer any questions. So if you do have any questions, thoughts, if there's another example that you want to walk through, please put that in the chat or the Q&A, and we will have time to get to them. So I created this this sort of guide, for lack of a better word, to really summarize what we talked about today and what the key pieces are to an effective prevention program. So if you are running a prevention program in your role, I encourage you to think about your specific program and how you would answer these questions in terms of the program that you're running. So the first one, does the prevention program try to stop violence before it actually happens? Or as we talked about, primary prevention. Again, not saying that secondary and tertiary prevention aren't effective. We know they are, and they definitely have a role to play. But our ultimate goal is to end sexual violence completely, right? And so in order to do that, we really have to focus on primary prevention. So does your program focus on primary prevention? Does your prevention program work to change at least 2 out of the 3 levers that we talked about: policy, culture, or practice? Again, obviously addressing all 3 is ideal, but we see incredible progress and impact with at least 2, being involved. So policy, culture, or practice. Does your prevention program address at least two of those? Does your prevention program put the onus of responsibility on everyone rather than just quote unquote potential victims? Just like we talked about, we know that prevention programs that only focus on potential victims are not as effective as the prevention programming that puts the onus of responsibility on everybody. So ideally, and if we're truly taking a systems change approach, then the prevention programs need to put the responsibility on everyone, and particularly those who hold power and privilege. And lastly, along those lines, does the prevention program approach the work from a racial justice lens? I think that for every prevention program, I mean, honestly, I think everybody in general, but definitely for prevention programming, we need to look at how we are contributing, especially as white folks, to white supremacy culture. And so those conversations really need to be had, especially in this field, which is still predominantly made up of white women serving other white women, that we need to understand our role in white supremacy culture and how our prevention programs are working to end that, and to really take this work from a racial justice lens. So for me, those are the four key pieces to an effective and successful prevention program. As I mentioned, obviously funding is a huge barrier. So I get that, our goal can be to address all four of these things, but we may not have the funding to do it. So everything I say comes with that caveat. But in an ideal world with unlimited funding, right, that prevention programs should be addressing all four of these, or answering all four of these questions. So with that being said, any questions? We do have a little bit of time left. So please, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. Or like I mentioned, if there's a specific example that you would like to walk through, we can do that as well. So you can put any questions or comments in the Q&A portion of the webinar, or feel free to put it in the chat as well. Thank you, Femina. Thank you for coming. All right, it looks like there are no questions. So if you do have any questions that come up or anything else, my contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out anytime. I am here. I love having these conversations and love talking about prevention. So please feel free to reach out. Brenna, is there anything that you need to share before we leave?
I just wanted to thank you, Caitlin. This was really fantastic and really engaging. I am glad that everyone in the chat was engaged and seemed to be loving it. So thank you very much. I believe Charlotte just put some content in the chat function. We do have a feedback form that we welcome everyone to fill out. And we also have some free downloadable resources on our website. She listed that link as well. And she will be in touch after today's training with a copy of those slides for you all. And she can include Caitlin's contact information in there for everyone as well. So thank you, Caitlin, very much again. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We'll give you back about 9 minutes of your day.
Great. Thank you, everybody.